The night he lifted the Champions League trophy, he sobbed into his shirt, not because he missed the penalty, but because his father never lived to see it. This is the true story of a boy who spent his childhood outrunning poverty, shame, and silence only to find that fame couldn't fix the wounds hiding underneath his world records. You'll discover the night he nearly gave up football for good, the hidden medical condition that almost stopped his heart forever, and the moment he whispered, "I'd trade all this just to talk to him again." But the question is, could he keep running once there was no one left to outrun? The wind that night pressed gently against the cracked shutters of a small room in Madeira. The air carried a hint of salt from the nearby sea, the kind of scent that clung to everything: clothes, curtains, memory. Inside that room, a boy stared up at a corrugated tin ceiling. He counted dents in the metal the way others counted stars. His mother thought he was sleeping, but he wasn't. He was listening. Not for dreams, but for the sound of his father's footsteps stumbling through the front door again. There were 4 children in that house, and only one room to fit them all. But even among the noise and closeness, he often felt like a stranger in his own life. The walls were too thin to hide anything. Not the late-night arguments, not the coughs soaked in alcohol, not the prayers his mother whispered when she thought no one else could hear. His name was Cristiano, and before the world knew him, he was just a boy trying to disappear beneath a thin blanket and a dream too big for the island he was born on. During the day, he ran not away from anything but towards something he couldn't name. On the black volcanic streets of Santo, he played barefoot, dodging cars and chasing worn-out footballs wrapped in duct tape. The soles of his feet were tough, like tree bark. His hunger wasn't just for food. It was for motion, escape, air. The locals called him Crybaby because he wept when his team lost. What they didn't see was how much he needed to win. Not for trophies, not yet, but for oxygen. Every goal he scored made it easier to breathe. His father, Dinas, worked as the kitman for a local club called Andorina. The job didn't pay much, but sometimes he brought home discarded balls, loose cleats, or team socks. These were gifts of gold in a house where toothpaste was sometimes shared, and dinners were sometimes skipped. Was a quiet Mangentel even, but he was sinking in beer, in hopelessness, in the kind of sadness that turns into silence. Cristiano watched this, watched and wondered if he could outrun the silence too. One day, while playing with friends near the parking lot of a supermarket, Cristiano saw something strange. A man had thrown away an old pair of sneakers. They were too big, the laces frayed, but Cristiano picked them up, washed them in a plastic bucket, and wore them anyway. He called them his first contract. He played harder in those shoes, faster, sharper, as if the shoes had to believe he was worth it. That moment, small, unnoticed, became his first secret. One he kept long after he had closets filled with golden boots. But there was another secret he never told anyone, not even his siblings. One night, after a fight between his parents, Cristiano had crept out of the house and run to the edge of the sea. He stood barefoot on the rocks, staring into the black water. He didn't cry, he didn't scream. He just whispered to the waves, "One day, I'll leave this island and never come back unless I have a reason." The sea said nothing, but the boy took its silence as a promise. By the time he turned 10, coaches already noticed something unusual. Not just his speed, but his fire. He played like he needed to prove something every second. Some said he was arrogant, but those close to him knew he wasn't trying to show off. He was trying to survive. The ball was the only thing in his life that made sense. It didn't drink, it didn't lie, it didn't disappear. If you respected the ball, it would respect you. That was the deal. His mother, Dolores, worked as a cook and cleaner, often taking double shifts. She fed other people's children while trying to keep her own from going hungry. Once, she admitted that during her pregnancy with Cristiano, she had considered not going through with it. The poverty was that bad. But something changed her mind. Maybe it was a dream. Maybe it was faith. Maybe it was the way his heart beat so fast during the ultrasound, like he was already running. Cristiano didn't know that story until much later. But maybe he felt it. Maybe that's why he ran the way he did, Daz, if he was still trying to earn the right to exist. One of his early coaches, watching him fly down the field, once asked, "Why does that boy always play like he's behind on something?" The answer wasn't tactical, it was emotional. He was behind on love, on peace, on safety, and he was trying to catch up. At age 12, everything changed. He got a chance to join Sporting Lisbon's academy, but it meant leaving his family, leaving the island, leaving the only place he'd ever known. The night before he left, he didn't sleep. He stared again at the tin ceiling, the familiar dents, the flickering shadows from a nearby street lamp. He didn't say goodbye to his father. He didn't know how. He just packed quietly and kissed his mother's forehead as she pretended to sleep. On the flight to Lisbon, his palms sweated, not from fear but from knowing this was it. His shot, the chance to make his promise to the ocean real. But when he arrived, the silence followed him. Different place, same feeling. He missed his mother's food, his siblings' noise, even his father's ghost steps. In Lisbon, the other boys laughed at his accent, mocked the way he dressed, called him the Islander. At first he cried in secret, but then he started staying behind after training. 1 hour, then 2, then 3. The coach would have to pull him off the field. That pain of being the outsider became a fire, a kind of vow. If he couldn't belong, he'd become undeniable. He started doing something strange. Before bed, he'd whisper to himself the names of the players he wanted to beat. Like prayers, Figo, Zidane, Raul, Beckham. He didn't say, "I hope," he said, "I will." Over and over. That list will come back later, and when it does, it will mean something more. But not yet, because first there was the sound. The one that could have ended everything. The racing heartbeat, the panicked hospital visit, the whispered word tachycardia. He was 15, and suddenly the dream felt like it had a stop sign. But that story, the one where he almost lost it all before it began, we'll get to that next. The cafeteria was a noisy place, filled with laughing voices, heavy footsteps, and the soft clink of metal trays. But to Cristiano, it always felt quiet. Not the kind of quiet that soothes, but the kind that makes a boy feel like he doesn't belong. He sat near the end of the long table each day, always in the same chair, always with his shoulders tucked in and his head bowed low. The food on his tray was simple, usually rice, sometimes a piece of fish, often something unfamiliar, but he hardly tasted it. He was too busy pretending not to notice the way the other boys avoided sitting near him. At the academy in Lisbon, Cristiano was the youngest. He was also the only boy from Madeira. His accent sounded strange to the others, like a song they didn't want to sing. They teased him for how he spoke, for how he dressed, even for how fast he ran if running too hard was a problem. At first he tried to laugh along, hoping they would stop, but they didn't, so he stopped trying. He learned to be quiet, to listen instead of speak. And when the teasing hurt, he held it in. He held everything in. Most days, he ate alone. But not just in the cafeteria. He trained alone when practice ended and the other boys headed for the showers, Cristiano stayed behind. He ran extra laps, practiced his free kicks, dribbled in the fading light until the shadows grew long and the field turned silver in the moonlight. It wasn't that he loved the work, it was that he needed it. The field didn't laugh at him, the ball didn't mock his voice. And out there, with only the sound of his breathing, he didn't feel so far away from home. At night, in his narrow dorm bed, he'd pull the blanket over his head and listen. Some nights, the boys in the next room whispered jokes until they fell asleep. Other nights, he heard the soft humming of the security lights outside the window. But what he listened for most was the sound of the sea. He couldn't hear it, of course, not in Lisbon, but in his mind, it was always there. The sea from back home in Madeira, crashing gently, calling softly, that sound lived inside him, like a quiet lullaby only he could hear. He missed his family. He missed his mother's voice, the most firm, kind, and always sure. She had packed his small suitcase with careful hands, folding each item like it mattered. She hadn't cried when he left, but he did, not in front of her. Later, alone in the bathroom of the ferry terminal, where the air smelled of oil and old salt, he cried into the sleeve of his sweater so no one would hear. He was 12, and the world suddenly felt too big. There was a routine he started not long after arriving. Before lights out, he would take a small notebook from under his mattress. It was bent at the corners and filled with uneven lines. On the first page, he had written the names of people who had doubted him, teachers who said he wouldn't make it, neighbors who said dreams were only for the rich, boys who had pointed and laughed. Each name was written in small, careful letters, and each night after training, if he felt he had done well, he would put a small line through one of them. A quiet victory, one name at a time. He never showed that notebook to anyone, not even his mother when she visited. It was his Alona map of pain that he was slowly learning to redraw. Someday, That notebook would matter more than he knew. But not yet. One memory stood out in his mind more than others. It wasn't a goal or a big win. It wasn't even from the field. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon. He had just finished training and was walking back toward the dorms. His socks were soaked, his legs sore, and he felt tired in a way that didn't come from running. A coach, one he hadn't spoken to much before, called out to him. "Why are you always the last one off the pitch?" the man asked. Cristiano shrugged. "Because I need to be." The coach watched him for a moment, then nodded and said nothing more. But something about that small moment stayed with Cristiano. It was the first time in Lisbon someone had seen him not just his speed or his footwork, but him. The boy who stayed late, the boy who ate alone, the boy who carried his dreams like they were the only thing he had. He was still learning what it meant to be far from home. Lisbon was a different world. The streets were faster, the people louder, the buildings taller. At night, the sky looked different, 2 less stars, more noise. But Cristiano began to grow inside that distance. He was still lonely, yes, but he was also changing. The teasing didn't stop, but it stopped mattering as much. He learned to smile in private, to laugh when no one was around, to find strength in silence. And he started to run differently, not just fast, but free, as if something had clicked inside him. His coaches began to notice. They said he had something rare, a fire that didn't dim, even on the hardest days. He began to move up quickly through age levels, through matches. One season he played for the under-16s, under-18s, and the senior team all at once. No one had done that before. And still, after every game, he practiced. Practiced as if he had lost. That drive came from something deeper than ambition. It came from the fear of losing everything, of having to go back home and tell his family it hadn't worked out, of proving the doubters right. He didn't want to be a star. He just wanted to become someone his mother didn't have to worry about anymore. Someone who could fix the holes in the roof. Someone who could bring peace to a house that had seen too many quiet heartbreaks. There were still hard days. Days when his body ached and his heart felt heavy. Days when the city felt too cold and the nights too long. But in those moments, he returned to the one thing that had never failed him. Movement, running, dribbling, shooting. The ball remained his only constant. When nothing else made sense, he knew how to strike it just right, how to curl it into the net like a whisper. And yet, beneath all that effort, there remained one unanswered question. What if it still wasn't enough? What if, despite all the practice, all the pain, all the nights he went to bed with empty arms and tired legs? What if he still couldn't make it? That question never left him. It followed him like a shadow, even on the brightest days. And then, just when he started to believe things were finally working, his heart betrayed him, or at least that's what it felt like. At 15, Cristiano was told something no young athlete ever wants to hear, something that could have ended everything he had worked for. His heart was beating too fast, too irregular, too dangerous. He had a condition called tachycardia, and without surgery, he might never play again. But that story, the story of how he faced a quiet hospital room, wondering if the dream was over, belongs to another night. Because what happened next would test not just his body, but the very core of who he was. It started with a flutter, not a sharp pain, not something loud or obvious, just a strange flutter in his chest that came and went. Sometimes during training, sometimes during rest, Cristiano didn't tell anyone at first. He thought maybe it was nothing, maybe it was just nerves, but deep down, a quiet fear had already started to grow. Not the kind of fear that makes you scream, but the kind that settles in your stomach like a stone and doesn't move. He was 15 when the doctors gave it a name, tachycardia, a condition where the heart beats too fast, too uneven, like it's skipping over itself. For most people, it would be a worry. For Cristiano, it was a wall between him and everything he had worked for. They told him he would need surgery. They told him it was routine, that he would be fine. But to a boy whose whole life was movement, the word surgery felt like a full stop. He didn't cry when they told him. He just nodded, small and quiet. But that night, lying in his narrow bed, he couldn't sleep. The sounds of the dorm were familiar, but inside his chest, it was not quiet. His heart beat like it was afraid, or maybe like it was angry. Angry at the idea of being stopped. The day of the surgery came quietly. There were no crowds, no bright lights, just the soft hum of machines and the gentle voices of nurses. Cristiano was calm, at least on the outside. Inside, he was remembering everything: the streets of Madeira, the ocean, the way his mother's hands felt when she hugged him goodbye, the sound of his father's boots by the door. Every small moment came rushing back like waves. The surgery didn't take long. They used a laser to fix the rhythm of his heart. When he woke up, the first thing he asked was when he could play again. The doctor smiled and said he needed rest. A few weeks, maybe more. But Cristiano didn't wait that long. Within days, he was back on the field. Not full training, just touches, simple drills, but enough to feel the ball again, enough to feel like himself. That was the thing. Football wasn't just a sport to him. It was a rhythm, a breath, a beat. When he couldn't play, it felt like the world lost its music. So when he laced up his boots again for the first time after surgery, even if just for a few minutes, he felt something return. Not all at once, but slowly, gently, like a light being turned back on. And yet, something inside him had changed. Before the surgery, Cristiano had always pushed himself hard, but now he pushed harder. He trained like someone who knew time could be taken away. He ran faster, stayed longer, practiced not just to get better, but because he knew what it was like to have it nearly taken from him. That fear never left completely. It lived in the background, a soft reminder that nothing is promised. He began practicing alone at night. After curfew, when the lights were dim and the dorms were quiet, he would sneak out with a ball and head to the side field. The grass there wasn't perfect. There were patches and uneven spots, but to him, it was a place to breathe. The streetlights nearby didn't reach that far, and one night, they flickered out completely. The whole field fell into shadow. But he didn't stop. That night became a secret, a moment burned into his memory. He couldn't see much, but he knew where the goal was. He knew where the line started. He began kicking the ball against the wall again and again. The sound was steady, a soft thud, then bounce, then silence, then thud again, over and over like a heartbeat. He lost track of time. He forgot the cold. All that remained was that rhythm. One ball, one boy, one wall, and a dream that refused to go dark. Later, when people asked where he got his focus, his drive, he never told them about that night. He never said a word about the dark field or the broken lights. But in his mind, that was the moment he became something different. Not just a boy with talent, but a boy with fire. One of his coaches noticed something shift. Cristiano didn't smile as much. He spoke less, but on the pitch, he burned. In every sprint, there was purpose. In every shot, precision. He wasn't just playing to win, he was playing to stay alive inside, as if every moment with the ball was a second chance. And people started to notice. Scouts, journalists, even players from the senior team. They saw this teenager with sharp eyes and sharper feet. They saw the way he cut through defenders, the way he moved like the ball was part of him. But what they didn't see were the nights alone. The fear he carried, the sound of a heartbeat he once feared would betray him. There was one more thing he kept to himself. Every time before a match, he would close his eyes and whisper something under his breath. Just one line, always the same: "Let me run." He didn't pray for goals or fame or trophies. Just to move, just to feel the grass beneath him, the air in his lungs, the weight of the ball on his foot, because he knew what it felt like to lose that. And in that quiet asking, there was something more. There was gratitude. And there was also guilt. Guilt that he had made it this far while others had not. Guilt that his father, whose own heart had slowed under the weight of too much sadness and drink, was slipping further away from him. Guilt that his mother still cleaned homes while he chased stadium lights. He carried all of that, even as he smiled for cameras. Even as the world began to whisper his name with wonder. And still, no one knew what was coming next. Not the scouts, not the coaches, not even Cristiano, because just around the corner, just beyond the next match, was a moment that would change everything. A single game, a single performance. One so unforgettable that it would send shockwaves across the football world. A game that would reach the ears of a man named Sir Alex Ferguson. And what happened that night would not only steal headlines, it would steal a coach's pen. There are some nights that feel like any other. The same routine, the same nerves, the same air pressing gently against your skin. And then, there are nights that change everything. Nights that quietly step into your life and leave footprints you'll never forget. For Cristiano, that night began just like all the others' dinner at the academy. lacing up his cleats in the locker room, breathing slowly as he pulled his jersey over his head. But in his chest, something felt different. Not fear, not excitement, just a stillness. Like the world was waiting. It was a friendly match, nothing huge, just Sporting Lisbon versus Manchester United. A game meant to test players and entertain fans. The stadium was full, but not overwhelming. The crowd hummed softly. Coaches chatted on the sidelines. No one knew what was coming. No one knew that this night simple, casual would become a turning point in football history. And right there in the crowd, sitting with arms crossed and a sharp gaze, was a man named Sir Alex Ferguson. He had seen thousands of players, trained hundreds, won trophies, built legends. But something about this boy from Madeira caught his eye before the match even began. It wasn't his build, or his boots. It was the way he moved during warm-up, focused, fluid, quiet, as if the ball didn't roll on the grass, but listened to his feet. Cristiano didn't look around, he didn't wave, he just played, because that's where he felt most like himself. The whistle blew, and the match began. From the very first touch, it was clear. Cristiano wasn't just fast, he was everywhere. His feet moved like water, smooth and sharp at the same time. He didn't just chase the ball, he danced with it, up the sideline, past defenders, cutting inside with a spin that made the crowd rise from their seats. The Manchester United players couldn't keep up. Again and again, he tore through them, not with power, but with purpose. He didn't score that night, but he didn't need to. By halftime, the United bench was buzzing. Players turned to each other, whispering. They weren't talking about tactics. They were talking about him, about number 28, about the boy with sharp eyes and quicker feet. One player, out of breath and laughing, said to Sir Alex, "We can't go home without signing him." Another said, "If we don't, someone else will." Sir Alex didn't respond right away. But when the second half ended, he reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a pen, and wrote something on the back of a program. It was short, just a name and a number. He didn't need to write more. He had seen enough. The decision was made. Cristiano didn't know about that moment. Not yet. He walked off the field, tired but calm. He shook hands, nodded at his teammates, and returned to the locker room like always. He sat on the bench, took off his cleats, and let his breath return to normal. There was no celebration. No hint that the world had just shifted beneath his feet, but the call came soon after. Manchester United wanted to sign him. A real offer, a real chance. A door opening wide. Cristiano stared at the wall when he heard the news. Not because he didn't believe it, but because part of him had always known. Not in a loud, proud way, but in that quiet voice inside him that had whispered through every lonely night, every empty dinner, every sprint in the rain. The move was fast. Within weeks, he was packing his things, not just his clothes, but his memories. The small journal under his bed, the photos of his mother, the only pair of boots he'd never thrown away cracked, and faded but still full of meaning. As he folded each item, he thought about where he had started. The streets of Madeira, the sea, the broken ball, stitched with tape, and now he was heading to England, to Old Trafford, to the Premier League, to a world that had once felt far away. He was only 18. The plane ride to Manchester was long and quiet. Cristiano looked out the window, watching clouds pass like soft ghosts. He thought about his mother, his siblings, and the face of his father, blurred now in memory. He wondered if his father would have been proud, if he would have smiled, or cried, or said something simple like, "You did it." But his father never saw that game, and he would never see Cristiano in a United jersey. That wound stayed hidden for a long time. When Cristiano landed in Manchester, the sky was gray and cold, different from Lisbon, different from home. The club car drove him through streets he didn't recognize, past buildings that looked like they belonged to someone else's life. But when he stepped onto the pitch at Carrington, the training ground, everything felt familiar again. The grass, the lines, the ball. Football was still football. No matter where you were, there was one memory from those early days in Manchester that Cristiano held close. It wasn't a goal. A teammate told her taller sat beside him after training. They didn't speak the same language well, but the man handed Cristiano a bottle of water and said, slowly, "You don't have to prove everything today." Cristiano didn't answer, but the words stayed with him, because deep down, he still felt like he had to. Every single day, he trained harder than anyone. He stayed late, came early, asked questions, watched videos, practiced free kicks after dark. The staff at Carrington said the lights were often still on long after everyone else had left. When asked why, he simply said, "Because I'm not finished." But under all the effort, under the speed and shine, was a quiet fear. What if they found out he wasn't ready? What if he let them down? What if he failed? And that fear, it became fuel. He used it, carried it, let it push him further. And that fire lit up the pitch every time he played. But there was still one piece missing, one person he couldn't impress, one shadow he couldn't outrun. Because back in Madeira, the man who had first handed him a football was already fading. And the boy who once kicked against a concrete wall in the dark, he would soon face the kind of heartbreak that no trophy could heal. But that's a story for another night. A story about loss, legacy, and a quiet video played in a silent room. When Cristiano first stepped into the Manchester United training ground, he felt like a guest in someone else's house. The air was colder than Lisbon. The ground felt firmer, heavier under his feet. The buildings looked older, but the silence inside them was louder. He tried to carry himself with confidence, but he was still the boy who had eaten alone, still the boy who whispered promises into the ocean wind. Now, he was just walking quieter hallways with louder expectations. They gave him number 7. It was more than just a shirt, it was a weight. That number had been worn by giants George Best, Eric Cantona, David Beckham, legends whose names were sung in stadiums. Cristiano held the jersey in his hands for the first time and didn't speak. He just nodded. Inside, his heart beat faster, not with fear, but with pressure. Not pressure from others, but from himself. He had always run like he was chasing something. Now it felt like something was chasing him too. He was only 18. His English was still broken. His routines were unfamiliar. He missed the food back home, missed the sun, missed the way his mother folded his clothes, but he didn't show any of that. Every day he arrived early to training, and every day he stayed late. Coaches said he worked like someone who had already failed and was trying to get it back. But Cristiano wasn't afraid of failing. He was afraid of not trying hard enough to deserve success. He had a small room in Manchester, just a bed, a desk, and a closet. The walls were plain. The window faced a narrow street. But inside that room, he created a world. He put up photos of his family, taped motivational words above his mirror. Each night, before sleep, he cleaned his cleats by hand, wiped them slowly, carefully, not because they were dirty, but because the routine made him feel grounded. It reminded him of home, of his father cleaning boots at Andrina's locker room, a father he was starting to miss more with each passing day. That feeling of missing started as a whisper. Then it became a quiet ache. Cristiano called home when he could. Sometimes his mother answered with joy. Other times her voice carried worry she didn't want to admit. His father wasn't doing well. He had stopped working. His drinking had worsened. There were hospital visits, warnings from doctors, and still, Dinah said little. He didn't ask about football. He didn't talk about goals. He just told Cristiano to stay focused. But Cristiano knew. He could hear it in the spaces between words. And still, he played. When he stepped onto the pitch at Old Trafford for the first time, it felt like standing inside a dream. The stadium was alive with sound, red and roaring, thousands of eyes, flags waving like fire. The announcer said his name, and it echoed across the sky. But Cristiano didn't hear any of it. He only heard the ball, the soft thud when it met his boot, the whistle, the breath in his lungs. That first touch felt like home. He didn't score, not in that match, but he didn't need to. He ran like a storm, passed like a whisper, and dribbled like the ball was part of him. The crowd stood when he moved. The stadium lit up when he sprinted. Even the other players older experienced nodded quietly. They saw it, that thing he carried, that fire that didn't come from fame, but from something deeper, something harder, something real. After the match, Sir Alex Ferguson walked past him in the tunnel. The coach didn't stop, didn't say much, just looked him in the eye and said, "Well done." Cristiano held onto those 2 words like a medal. They became a sentence he repeated to himself on harder days. Well done. He wrote it down in his notebook that night, the same small notebook he had carried from Madeira, still folded, still quiet. He wrote it in the corner of a page already filled with names he had crossed out. People who said he wouldn't make it, wouldn't last, wouldn't belong. And right next to those words, he drew a small star, not to mark a finish line, but a beginning. The weeks that followed were full of learning. New drills, new tactics, new rules, but more than anything, new silence. Because with each new match, with each cheer from the crowd, came the growing silence of his father. Calls home became shorter. His sister told him their father was losing weight, sleeping more, drinking earlier in the day. He tried to visit, but the season was demanding. The team needed him. The pressure was rising, and inside his chest, the ache grew. One night after training, Cristiano stayed on the pitch by himself. The stadium was empty. The sky above was soft and gray. He placed the ball at the penalty spot and stood in silence. Not to shoot, just to feel the air. Just to be alone with the weight he couldn't talk about. Then he whispered, "I wish you could see me now." But his father never would. That moment, the one Cristiano didn't speak of would live inside him for the rest of his life. A moment he would return to again and again. The match that brought him to the world had also pulled him farther from the man who once tied his shoes. And no matter how many goals he scored, he could never outrun that feeling. Still, he kept moving, kept running, kept becoming. Because even in grief, he found purpose. Even in distance, he found drive. Even in the growing silence of his father's voice, he found a deeper reason to speak with his feet. And yet, he hadn't faced the full weight of what was coming. There was a night ahead, a private night when a man he barely knew would sit beside him and show him something that would break and heal him all at once. A video, just a few minutes long, but in that short recording, he would hear his father's voice. One last time. The stadium was loud that day, the air sharp with tension. Flags waved like flames in the wind. It was the summer of 2006. Cristiano stood on the pitch in green and red. Portugal versus England. The whole world was watching. Cameras ready, eyes wide. Every breath he took felt heavy, full of the weight of his country, of his past, of all the quiet promises he had whispered into dark skies as a child. He was no longer the boy who trained alone in the shadows. He was the star now. And with that came a spotlight he wasn't ready for. Midway through the game, a moment happened. A foul, a push, an argument. Wayne Rooney, his Manchester United teammate, was shown a red card, sent off the field, and just like that, the match shifted. The stadium erupted. People screamed, fingers pointed. And in the middle of it all, Cristiano stood still and silent. The cameras zoomed in on his face, and around the world, people began to say it was him, Cristiano Ronaldo, who got Rooney sent off. Overnight, he became a villain. In England, fans burned his jersey. Newspapers printed headlines calling him a traitor. The same country that had welcomed him, that had cheered him on at Old Trafford, turned on him. He was only 21, still learning how to carry the weight of the number on his back, still healing from the loss of his father, still trying to understand what fame really meant. And now, the world was shouting his name, not in praise, but in anger. When he returned to Manchester, he felt it in the air. Whispers on the street, cold stares, and even teammates looked at him differently. He didn't speak much in those first few days. He kept his head down, focused on training. But every time he stepped onto the pitch, he could feel the ghost of that red card following him. A silent shadow. That year, he started practicing in private, not just at the club, but at night. Sometimes he would borrow a set of cones and a ball, find a quiet stretch of field behind the training ground, and run drills by himself, over and over. Sprint, stop, turn, shoot, over and over again. Not to prove a point to the world, but to remind himself he still knew who he was. That boy from Madeira, the one who kicked against cracked walls under broken lights, the one who never gave up. There was one night, after a long training session, when he stayed so late the staff had already gone. Only one security guard remained, sitting in a small booth near the gate. Cristiano walked past him with his hoodie pulled low. The guard asked him, gently, "Why do you stay so long?" Cristiano looked at the sky for a moment, then said quietly, "Because I don't want to lose who I was before all this." Then he kept walking. That moment stayed with the guard for years. He told the story later, long after Cristiano had become one of the most famous players on earth. But in that moment, he was still just a young man trying to hold on to something soft in a world that felt hard. And behind the scenes, another presence was watching over him. Sir Alex Ferguson, the man who signed him, the man who gave him the number 7 shirt, the man who saw not just a player, but a person. One afternoon, after a tough match, Sir Alex called Cristiano into his office. The room was quiet, the lights dim. There were old photos on the wall, trophies on the shelf, but none of that mattered. What mattered was what Sir Alex had in his hand, a small remote. He clicked it, and a video began to play on the old TV in the corner. It was grainy, the colors soft, the audio slightly muffled, but the voice was clear. It was Cristiano's father, Dinis Avedo, speaking to a local reporter back in Madeira, praising his son, smiling in a way Cristiano hadn't seen in years, saying words Cristiano never got to hear in real life, that he was proud, that he knew his boy would do something great, that he believed in him. Cristiano didn't say a word. He just stared at the screen, eyes wide, hands still, mouth closed. When the video ended, the room stayed silent. Sir Alex didn't speak. He just stood, placed a hand on Cristiano's shoulder, and nodded once, then left the room. And in that quiet moment, something inside Cristiano broke. But it was the kind of breaking that heals, the kind that lets light in. He stayed in the office long after the door had closed, just breathing, just remembering. He had always carried his father's absence like a weight. Now he carried his love like a compass. That video was a gift, a moment of truth wrapped in tape and dust, and he never forgot it. After that day, something shifted. He started smiling more at training. He spoke a little louder, laughed a little easier. But on the field, he was sharper, more focused, like someone who had found the missing piece of a puzzle he had been building since he was a boy. That season, he became unstoppable. His goals doubled. His footwork was cleaner, his passes more precise. Fans who had once booed him now stood in awe. But even as the cheers returned, he stayed grounded. Each night, he returned to his routine, his room, his cleats, his mirror with the taped-up words, and one new photo, his father, smiling, framed beside his bed. There's a small story from that time he never told anyone, a ritual he started alone. Before each match, when the locker room was buzzing, when teammates were getting dressed and music played low, he would take out a folded piece of paper from his bag. It wasn't much, just a short note written in his own handwriting. It said, "Play like he's watching." He'd hold it for a moment, then fold it back, and walk onto the pitch each game, every single time. That note never changed, and it never will. But fame is a strange thing. It gives and it takes. And just as Cristiano was rising to new heights, another kind of storm was already forming, a storm that would test everything he had built. Because the more people cheered, the more they watched. And the more they watched, the more they searched for something to break. But before that storm came, there was one more season that would define him, one that would make him a legend and open a door that led to Madrid. There are moments in life that don't knock loudly. They slip in like a breeze through a quiet window. You don't hear them arrive, but they change the way the room feels forever. For Cristiano, that moment came not with shouts or cheers, but with quiet trust. A door opened, not the kind made of wood, but the kind made of belief. And the person standing on the other side was Sir Alex Ferguson. Cristiano had been scoring goals. He had been breaking records. But what Sir Alex saw wasn't just the boy on the scoreboard. He saw the one who cleaned his boots by hand, the one who stayed behind after training, the one who didn't ask for attention but worked like someone carrying something deep inside. That kind of hunger, the quiet kind, is rare. And Sir Alex, a man who had seen everything, saw something different in Cristiano. They began talking more, not about tactics or numbers, but about life, about loss, about how to lead. Sir Alex didn't give long speeches. He asked small questions. He offered short advice. But those short words felt like anchors. They steadied Cristiano when fame began to tilt the world around him. In Cristiano's eyes, Sir Alex wasn't just a coach. He became something softer, something stronger, a mentor, a father figure, a hand that didn't need to hold but always reached out when it mattered. There was a routine Cristiano started after that. Every Monday morning before training, he would knock on Sir Alex's office door and step inside. Not for praise, not to ask for a new role, just to sit. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't. But in that silence, Cristiano found something he had missed since his father passed away, someone who believed in him without needing him to be perfect. That quiet bond became his shield. Because as Cristiano's star grew brighter, the world began to push closer. He was on magazine covers, billboards, news channels. His face was everywhere. His goals became headlines. His moves turned into GIFs. His wins became shared around the globe within seconds. But behind the scenes, he was still just 22. still waking up at night, checking his phone for texts from home, still calling his mother after every game, still visiting his father's grave in his dreams. And not everything was easy. Some days, he felt like he was losing pieces of himself. The louder the crowd got, the harder it became to hear his own thoughts. Fame has a way of filling every room, even the quiet ones. He began to notice that people looked at him differently. Strangers stared longer. Reporters dug deeper. They weren't looking for joy. They were waiting for cracks, waiting for him to fall. But he didn't fall. He flew. That season, Cristiano gave the world something it hadn't seen in years. A blend of grace and grit, art and hunger. He scored 42 goals. He ran with fire. Every time he touched the ball, the crowd leaned forward. Something magical might happen, and often it did. He won the Premier League. He won the Golden Boot, and then, on a rainy night in Moscow, he stepped onto the field for the Champions League final. The night was wet and heavy, the grass slick. The lights like stars pushed too close to the ground. Manchester United faced Chelsea. Every pass, every step, every breath mattered. In the first half, Cristiano rose high into the air and headed the ball into the net. The stadium shook, his teammates ran to him, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. But later, during the penalty shootout, he missed. The ball curved the wrong way. He held his head in his hands. He felt his chest tighten. Was it all slipping away? But then, his teammates lifted him up, and when United won, he didn't run to the cameras. He didn't jump for joy. He knelt in the rain, cried quietly, and whispered, "Thank you." That moment, soft, soaked, full of feeling, became one of his most human memories. Because sometimes the best victories come not from being perfect, but from being carried when you feel broken. After that night, everything changed. He won the Ballon d'Or, the highest award in football. He became the best in the world, and still, something inside him stayed the same. He still trained first, still stayed last, still whispered to himself before every match, "Play like he's watching." But something new began to bloom too. A question: what now? When you climb the mountain you've stared at your whole life, what's left? For Cristiano, the answer came quietly and from far away. From Spain, from a club where legends had played, Real Madrid, they called, and the world listened. The transfer fee was the largest in history. The announcement was on every screen. And yet, behind all the flash and fire, Cristiano did the same thing he had always done. He packed his bag carefully, folded his clothes, wrapped his old boots in a towel, and sat on his bed in silence. That night, he looked around his Manchester apartment. At the photos, the mirror, the note taped above it. "Play like he's watching." He didn't take it down, he left it there, as a reminder of the boy who had once needed that room, and now had to say goodbye, because the next chapter would be different. Not just bigger, but harder. In Madrid, he would find things he wasn't ready for. Pressure that fame had only hinted at, voices louder than love, and a stage that demanded more than goals. It demanded a version of him he wasn't sure he could carry. But before he could know all that, he had to take one more flight to one more city, to meet a version of himself that fame had already started to shape. The sun was already high over Madrid when Cristiano arrived. The air was warm, the sky a bright, cloudless blue. Photographers waited at every gate. Fans gathered by the stadium, singing, shouting, pressing signs against the rails. It was the biggest welcome the club had ever seen. Over 80,000 people filled the seats just to see him walk onto the pitch, not to play, just to wave, to juggle a ball, to smile. And yet, even with all those voices rising around him, he felt something else. Not joy, not pride, pressure. It sat on his shoulders like a shadow, not loud, but heavy. It reminded him of the nights in Madeira when he lay awake staring at the tin roof. The world was watching now. Every step, every touch, every word. And deep inside, he knew that everything would be different here. Real Madrid wasn't just another club, it was a world of its own. And he wasn't just a player anymore. He was an idea, a name that lived on jerseys and billboards, a symbol of perfection. But perfection is not a home. It is not a place you can rest. And Cristiano, no matter how fast he ran, was about to learn just how high the price of that spotlight could climb. He moved into a house outside the city, modern, quiet, large windows, and white walls. But it didn't feel like home, not yet. The rooms were too still, the silence too clean. He missed the messy corners of his mother's kitchen, missed the way the curtains in Manchester swayed when the wind pressed against the glass, so he started creating new routines, small things to make the space feel familiar. He kept his training gear in the same spot by the front door. He cleaned his boots before bed, even when they were already spotless. He taped a new note above his bathroom mirror. This one said, "Earn it again tomorrow." And every morning before the sun touched the windows, he was already up, running, stretching, breathing. There was something different about how he trained now. It wasn't just about winning. It was about keeping pace with the person the world thought he already was. A champion, a hero, a machine. And even when he smiled for interviews or waved at fans, he was still asking himself the same question. Is this enough? He knew what people expected. They wanted goals. They wanted records. They wanted him to be the strongest, the fastest, the best, every single match. And so he gave more. He trained harder. He ate with strict rules. He slept with a plan. He studied his movements, watched footage of every game. He even changed the way he ran to save just enough energy for one final sprint in the 90th minute. To the world, he was becoming superhuman, but inside, he was still very human. Still the boy who ran barefoot through the back streets of Funchal. Still the teenager who cried in the showers after being teased. Still the son who never got to hear his father say, "I saw your goal." He held on to those memories tightly, even as he filled stadiums with magic. There was one quiet ritual he never gave up. After every home match, once the crowd had gone and the reporters had finished, Cristiano would walk the pitch alone. Just once, slowly. No cameras, no music. Just him and the grass. The same green that had been there for every kick, every step. He would whisper a thank you to the field, then head back inside. No one knew he did that. He never told anyone. It was just his way of staying grounded, of remembering that before all the fame, it was always just about the ball, about the feel of it on his foot, the sound it made when it hit the net, the joy it brought when no one else was watching. And yet, even with all this care, all this effort, the pressure kept rising. Madrid expected perfection, and anything less brought questions. The media watched closely. If he didn't score, they wrote stories. If he smiled too little, they called him cold. If he smiled too much, they called him arrogant. There was no middle, no room to breathe. And in that tight space, a quiet kind of loneliness began to grow. He still called home often, spoke to his mother almost daily. But even her warm words couldn't always quiet the noise in his mind. There was one night, after a difficult loss, when he sat alone in his kitchen. The lights were low. A half-eaten meal sat untouched on the counter. He scrolled through comments on his phone. So many strangers, so many opinions. And somewhere between the praise and the criticism, he found himself staring at the screen without blinking. He turned the phone off and sat in silence. Then, slowly, he walked to the mirror in the hallway, looked at himself, and said softly, "You are still enough." It was a moment that passed quickly, but it meant everything, because even the strongest hearts need reminding. Even the fastest feet need rest, and even legends need to be told they are more than what they do. That year, he broke more records. He became Madrid's top scorer. He lifted trophies. He smiled on stage. But behind the scenes, he was still battling the weight of expectation, still asking himself if he was doing enough, still wondering if people loved the real him or just the version they had created. And tucked away in his closet, among designer shoes and crisp uniforms, was a small box. Inside it, folded carefully, was the old note from Manchester. "Play like he's watching." He had brought it with him, never showed it, but always kept it close. Because some things don't need to be shared to be true. That note, and the feeling it carried, would guide him through the hardest parts of what was to come. Because soon, the game would get even faster, the spotlight even hotter, and the questions even louder. But first, there would be one unforgettable night, a night in rain-soaked boots, a missed penalty, a quiet prayer, and a moment that would finally answer the question he had asked for years. The air was thick with rain that night in Moscow. Not heavy rain, not a storm, just a soft, steady drizzle that turned every breath into mist and every blade of grass into a slippery thread. The stadium lights cut through the fog like glowing towers, their reflections dancing in puddles across the pitch. Cristiano stood quietly near the tunnel, pulling on his gloves, staring at the dark sky above. It wasn't just a final, it was the biggest game of his life. It was the 2008 Champions League final. Manchester United versus Chelsea. A game that could turn dreams into medals, or leave hearts shattered in the mud. As he walked onto the pitch, the sound of the crowd was deafening. But to Cristiano, it all faded into something softer. Just a background hum. What he heard instead was the sound of his own breath, the squish of his boots against the damp turf, and the small voice in his mind that had never truly gone quiet, play like he's watching. The match began quickly. Tackles flew in. Passes zipped across the slick field. The ball moved like it had a mind of its own, skipping, bouncing, slipping past boots. Cristiano tried to stay calm. He found his rhythm early, dribbled down the left wing, cut inside, moved with the same graceful fire that had brought him to this moment. Then, in the 26th minute, it happened. A perfect cross floated through the air. Cristiano leaped into the sky, rising above the defenders like he was being lifted. His forehead met the ball, and with a thud, it flew past the goalkeeper into the net. The crowd erupted. Teammates rushed toward him. His name rang through the stadium. He had scored in a Champions League final, but he didn't smile right away. He closed his eyes, tilted his face toward the rain, and whispered, "For you, Pi." That goal should have been the start of the perfect ending. But life doesn't always follow the script. Chelsea equalized before halftime. The game tightened. Tension wrapped around every pass, every shot, every touch. It went to extra time. Then, penalties. The sky above was dark now, the rain still falling, the world holding its breath. Cristiano was third in line for United. He stood at the halfway line, his hands resting on his hips, watching as the first two players scored. Then it was his turn. He walked slowly toward the penalty spot. The mud squelched beneath his boots. His heart beat steady, but not calm. He placed the ball down carefully, stepped back, took a breath. Then he missed. He slipped slightly. The ball went the wrong way. The goalkeeper saved it. And just like that, Cristiano froze. His hands went to his face. The weight of the world fell hard and fast. Tears welled up in his eyes. He wanted to disappear, to rewind, to start over, but he couldn't. He had missed. And in that moment, under those lights, in front of millions, he felt like a failure. He walked back slowly, head low, each step heavier than the last. He sat on the bench, eyes full, watching the rest of the shootout unfold in silence. Then, something unexpected happened. His teammate, Edwin van der Sar, saved the final penalty. Manchester United won. The team rushed the field. The crowd exploded. Medals were handed out. And amid the celebration, Cristiano collapsed onto the grass. Not from pain, but from release. He cried openly. Not because they had won, but because he had missed. Because after all the training, all the effort, all the pressure, he had slipped, and for a moment, he felt like it had all been ruined. But his teammates didn't let him stay on the ground. They lifted him, hugged him, held him. They reminded him of something he had forgotten. That one miss doesn't erase 1,000 hours of heart. That even in the hardest moments, you don't have to carry it alone. Later, in the locker room, he sat quietly. His medal rested against his chest, still damp, still warm. Sir Alex walked by, stopped beside him, and said softly, "You showed the world your heart tonight." Cristiano nodded. He didn't speak, but inside, something shifted. That moment didn't break him. It shaped him, because the boy who always tried to be perfect finally learned what it meant to be human. He went home that night with soaked socks and tired eyes. He looked in the mirror. The note was still there. Play like he's watching, but now he read it differently. Not with pressure, but with peace, because maybe playing like his father was watching meant showing every side of himself, the joy, the fear, the failure, and the strength to keep going anyway. There was a story from that night he never told. After the match, while most players celebrated in hotels and clubs, Cristiano walked alone through the team's hallway. He passed a janitor mopping the floor. They nodded at each other. The janitor smiled and said, "You scored the one that counted most." Cristiano looked confused. "You scored the one your father saw," the man said, then kept mopping. Cristiano never found out who he was. But those words stayed with him, long after the cameras stopped, long after the medals were stored away, because some victories aren't seen by millions. Some are felt quietly, in the heart, in the soul, in the space where memories live. The world thought that final made him a champion, but it wasn't the trophy. It was the moment he stood back up. That was the true win. That season closed with more awards. more headlines, more attention. But Cristiano returned to his quiet routines. He trained, he rested, he whispered to the field, and he began to feel something inside him calling for more. Not more fame, not more money, something deeper. Something that would lead him to a new chapter, a new team, a new city. But before that chapter opened, the weight of everything he had built would begin to press harder than ever. The morning Cristiano left Manchester was quiet. No big send-off, no loud farewells. Just a suitcase by the door, a folded note on the kitchen table, and the hum of the engine waiting outside. It wasn't the goodbye people imagined, but for him, it was enough. He looked around his apartment one last time. The framed photo of his father, the mirror with the faded note still taped above it, and the pair of boots he never wore, but never threw away. Then he stepped outside, into a new chapter of his life. He was going to Madrid. The deal was the biggest in football history. Newspapers called it a storm. Sports channels ran countdowns. Fans held up signs outside airports and training grounds. 80,000 people filled Santiago Stadium just to see him hold a jersey. Not to play, not to score, just to stand there, to smile, to wave. It was the kind of welcome fit for a king. But Cristiano didn't feel like royalty. Not inside. Inside, he felt small again. Not because he doubted himself, but because he knew what was coming. The higher you rise, the harder the world watches. And Madrid wasn't just any club. It was a machine. A mirror, a storm. That day, as he walked across the field to meet the crowd, his name echoing in the air, he remembered the narrow streets of Madeira. He remembered the tin roof, the patched ball, the way his mother held his face in her hands the night he left home for the first time. So much had changed. And yet the boy in him was still there, hidden beneath the sharp suit and bright lights, still listening for the sound of his father's voice in the wind. The pressure in Madrid was different. It didn't shout, it whispered. It crept into every interview, every training session, every step on the pitch. He was no longer just playing for points, he was playing for history. Every goal was compared, every mistake magnified. And slowly, the game he loved began to feel like something else, like a job, like a performance, like a race he could never stop running. But he didn't let it show, not to his teammates, not to the media, not even to his family. He trained harder, stayed longer, slept less. He added new layers to his routine: ice baths, cryotherapy, recovery chambers, diet tweaks, breathing techniques. Everything was measured, controlled, pushed. It wasn't obsession, it was survival. Because in Madrid, success wasn't celebrated for long. It was expected. And if you delivered, they cheered. But if you didn't, they moved on. There was a room in his house that no one entered but him. Small, quiet, white walls. One window. In that room, he kept his trophies. Not on display, but lined against the wall in careful rows. Ballon d'Ors, golden boots, framed jerseys, even the Champions League medal from Moscow. He didn't go in there often, but when he did, he stood in silence. Not to admire, but to remember that every piece came with a price, and not all prices are paid in money. Some are paid in sleep, in solitude, in the soft ache of missing out on life while chasing something bigger than yourself. One night, after a hard loss, he sat on the floor of that room. The light was low, his socks still wet from the match. He stared at a photo of his younger self, a boy with skinny legs and wide eyes, holding a ball almost bigger than his chest. He smiled, not because he felt joy, but because that boy still lived inside him, still whispered reminders, still asked, "Are we still doing this for love?" That question stayed with him, especially in moments when the world felt too loud. Madrid brought glory, yes, but it also brought loneliness. People saw the goals, the celebrations, the fame. They didn't see the quiet dinners, the early mornings, the empty chairs around his table, the cold side of the bed. He had friends, he had fans, but he missed something softer, something slower, something real. And as the years passed, that hunger for connection grew. It showed in small ways, in the way he began passing the ball more, smiling wider after assists, clapping for teammates more often. He was still fierce, still sharp, but there was tenderness behind the power now. Like a man learning that strength and softness aren't enemies but companions. There's a story from that time his teammates still talk about. After a tough match, Cristiano stayed behind to train. The sun was setting, most players had left, but he stayed, working on free kicks, ball after ball, over and over. One of the younger players returned to get something he'd forgotten. He stopped and watched for a while, then asked, "Why are you still here?" Cristiano looked at the ball, then at the goal, then said, "Because this part still makes me feel alive." That moment wasn't recorded, it wasn't shared, but it was real. And sometimes, real is enough, but not everyone understood him. The media created stories, called him arrogant, said he was chasing records, not respect. They said he smiled too much when he scored, celebrated too hard, wore too much cologne, too many watches. But they didn't see the boy cleaning his boots at night. Didn't hear the voice in his head that still whispered, "Earn it again tomorrow." They didn't know about the notebook he kept in his drawer, the one from Lisbon, the one with names written and crossed out. People who doubted, people who laughed, people who told him he wouldn't make it. That notebook was still there, still growing. But now, instead of crossing out names, he had started writing something new. Just 2 words, soft and quiet. Thank you, because he was beginning to learn something. That the people who doubted him had helped shape him. Not with kindness, but with challenge, and sometimes challenge builds the strongest roots. But even as he rose higher, he still searched for something deeper, something beyond goals, beyond games. He started looking toward home more, calling his mother more often, spending time with his siblings. He even began asking his team to record his games, not to watch himself, but to send clips to his young son, who had started kicking a ball of his own. There was a day he never forgot. After scoring his 200th goal for Madrid, he returned home and found a note on the fridge, written in crayon. 3 words, "You're my hero." It wasn't signed, but he knew who it was from. And for the first time in a long time, he sat on the kitchen floor and cried. Not from sadness, but from something softer. A feeling that maybe, just maybe, the real victories in life didn't wear jerseys. Maybe they wore small hands and wide eyes. And maybe the boy from Madeira was finally becoming something more than a player. Maybe he was becoming whole. But just as he began to feel that gentle shift, a storm was building. A storm not from the pitch, but from the pressure, from the weight, from a world that never sleeps. And what came next would test not just his strength, but his heart. There's a kind of silence that doesn't come from quiet. It comes from fullness, from too much noise, too many people, too many lights. Cristiano knew that silence well. He could feel it in hotel rooms after long matches, where the air conditioning hummed softly and the world outside kept spinning. He could feel it in the way his phone buzzed with messages he didn't want to answer. He could feel it in the hallway outside his bedroom, where no footsteps echoed anymore. He was at the peak of his career, trophy after trophy. Another Ballon d'Or records breaking beneath his feet like dry twigs. But inside something was shifting, slowly, quietly, like water rising inside a glass, without a sound. A kind of emotional tiredness that didn't show in the muscles or the breath but in the space between moments. In the deep pause after the cheering faded, in the soft glance toward an empty chair, he had won almost everything. But sometimes, when he walked onto his balcony after a match, he'd stand there, alone, and stare out at the night. Madrid glittered below, endless lights like stars that had fallen and decided to stay. And yet, in all that glow, the balcony always felt cold, too wide, too quiet. There was no one there to say, "You did it." No father, no lifelong friend. Just the soft rustle of curtains behind him and the distant hum of traffic. That's when the ache would return. Not loud, not sharp, just present. A reminder that even success has a cost, and some costs are paid in missing moments no one else even sees. There was one night that made this clear. It was the summer of 2016. Cristiano had led Portugal to the finals of the European Championship. It was a dream, many said, would never come true. But in the opening minutes of the match, something happened. He was tackled, hard. His knee twisted awkwardly. He tried to stand, tried to shake it off, tried to keep going, but his leg gave out. He collapsed, and just like that, the dream started to slip away. Tears rolled down his face not from pain, but from heartbreak. He knew he had to be carried off. As he left the field, wrapped in the arms of staff, he kept looking back. Not at the scoreboard, but at his teammates. He had promised to lead them. Now, he could only watch, wrapped in a jacket, with tears drying on his cheeks. But what happened next surprised everyone. Cristiano didn't retreat. He stood on the sidelines, shouting instructions, clapping, pacing, coaching. It was as if he had poured his spirit into each of them. And when Portugal scored in extra time and won the title, Cristiano dropped to his knees, arms raised, not because he scored, not because he played, but because the team had won, and his heart was there with them. Later, after the trophy was lifted, after the pictures were taken, after the champagne dried, he returned to his hotel. Alone, he stood on the balcony of his suite and called his mother. Then he called his sister. And finally, he tried to call his father's old number. It didn't work, of course, but he called anyway, just to hear the silence. And in that silence, he whispered, "Pi, we did it." Then he sat on the balcony floor and watched the city sleep. No one knocked, no one came, just the stars above and the ache in his chest. He had never felt so full and so empty at the same time. That moment became a memory he carried like a soft bruise. A reminder that even the biggest wins still leave space where something once lived, and that space never really disappears. He tried to fill it with love, with people, with family. But even their life brought storms. He became a father again, a beautiful moment. But the path was complicated. There were questions, whispers, stories in the press, and through it all, he stayed silent, protective, guarded. He held his children close, tighter than any trophy, because fame could take many things, but not this, not the quiet bond of a parent and child, not the softness of a baby's breath on his neck, not the joy of hearing, "Papa, did you score today?" He started building more walls around his private life, not because he didn't care, but because he cared so deeply. He wanted his children to grow up with peace, not headlines, not pressure, just love. He kept them out of the spotlight. But at home, he became something different, gentler, more playful. He learned how to braid hair, how to make pancakes, how to slow down when little voices asked for one more story before bed. And yet, even in this growing light, the shadows still moved. His mother became ill again. Cancer had returned. He flew home between matches to sit beside her, held her hand in hospital rooms, whispered the same words she once whispered to him when he was sick. "It's going to be okay." But deep down, he knew life was fragile, that even the strongest people grow tired. He watched her sleep one night, machines blinking gently around her, and he remembered being a boy, watching her clean hotel rooms just to feed them. That image had never left him, and now it returned in full color. He promised himself he would protect her, no matter what. He donated money, funded hospitals, signed checks without blinking. But more than that, he stayed. He showed up, because love isn't in the gifts. It's in the time, in the presence, in the quiet way you sit beside someone when they don't want to talk, just to remind them they're not alone. And yet, he still felt alone sometimes, in the crowd, on the plane, in the hallway of award shows. The more he achieved, the more distant some things became. He began to ask himself harder questions. What's left to prove? What am I still running from? And if I stop, who will I be? He didn't have the answers, not yet, but he had started to look. He started reading more, listening more, opening small pieces of himself, to a woman who made him laugh again, to a son who reminded him of the boy he used to be, to a kind of love that didn't need applause, just presence. But even that piece would be tested, because the world doesn't stop turning, and soon everything he had built would begin to shake from inside, and he would have to decide, will he hold on to the mask, or finally show them the man behind it. There are moments when the world slows down, not because of time, but because something inside you shifts. You look at life differently. You start to listen more. You feel more. And for Cristiano, that shift began with something as soft as a smile, a simple meeting, a quiet hello, a voice that didn't ask for anything but presence. Her name was Georgina. He met her at a store. Ordinary people meet there every day. But nothing about this felt ordinary. She wasn't chasing a photo. She wasn't staring at him like the world did. She spoke gently, moved slowly, looked into his eyes like they were just eyes, not headlines. For the first time in a long time, he felt seen not as Cristiano Ronaldo, but as a man, a son, a brother, a father, a human being. Their connection grew like morning light. Quiet at first, then warmer, then brighter. They shared simple things, walks, jokes, dinners with no phones. She listened when he talked about his past. She didn't try to fix anything. She just sat beside him, present. And when she met his son, her hands moved with care, not performance. She braided his hair, packed his school bag, helped him tie his shoes. Cristiano watched her and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not the kind that comes from winning, but the kind that comes from being home. He started changing. Not because she asked him to, but because her softness made room for his softness. He began playing differently too, not less hungry, but more generous. His passes became more thoughtful. He celebrated others more than himself. And at home, he slowed down. He stopped checking his phone during dinner, started reading bedtime stories, started learning how to cook just one dish. But still, he stopped rushing through moments and began living in them. One night, while brushing his son's teeth, his boy asked, "Do you love her more than football?" Cristiano smiled, then said, "They live in different rooms of my heart." That answer wasn't rehearsed, it was real. Because something in him was learning how to love without fear, to be close without running, to be still without guilt. But the world didn't slow down with him. He still had matches. Travel schedules that spun like wheels without brakes, and with fame, even peace is questioned. The media called their love a show, said it was too perfect, too quiet, too clean. But Cristiano didn't respond. He just lived. Let his actions be his answer. Because some things are too sacred for headlines, and his family was one of them. There was a morning when Georgina handed him their newborn daughter, Alana, tiny, warm, wrapped in a white blanket. He held her like glass, then looked up, eyes full of wonder, and said, "How can someone so small carry this much joy?" He rocked her in the same chair where he once watched his father drink in silence, and in that moment, he felt something new, healing, a quiet mending, a loop closing, not perfectly, but gently. He began to understand that his past didn't need to define every part of his future. It could shape him, guide him, but not trap him. He started revisiting old things too. Madeira, the streets, the tin roof. He walked those alleys not as a boy running toward something, but as a man coming back. He visited the stadium where his father once swept floors, brought flowers to his grave. He didn't say much, just stood there, let the wind speak for him. And later that night, as the stars pressed against the dark sky, he whispered, "I'm learning how to breathe again." Back in Madrid, he began giving more to others, donated quietly, supported hospitals during the pandemic, built centers for children, gave meals to families who reminded him of his own, not for praise, but because he knew what it felt like to go to bed with hunger in your stomach and hope in your chest. He never forgot that ache, and now he used his blessings to soften it for others. But even in this season of warmth, shadows lingered. Life doesn't pause because you're healing. It tests you again and again. One of those tests came when he least expected it. They were expecting twins. Joy filled the house. They painted the nursery, bought matching clothes, 2 tiny cribs side by side. But during delivery, only one child survived. Their baby boy did not make it. The moment they placed him in Cristiano's arms, everything went quiet. The room, the air, the world. He kissed his son's forehead, held him close, and cried like he hadn't cried in years. Not loud, but deep, from the bones, from the soul. Georgina wept beside him, and together, in that hospital room, they met both life and loss in the same breath. They named the surviving twin Bella because she was beautiful and strong, and because her heartbeat reminded them that love can rise from sorrow. Cristiano didn't return to the pitch right away. He stayed home, held his daughter every morning, sat beside Georgina at night, and told stories to his other children about stars. And how sometimes the brightest ones don't stay long, but they still shine forever. That moment soft, shattering, sacred changed him. It taught him something new, that being strong isn't about hiding pain. It's about holding it with care, about letting it breathe, about saying, "This hurts," and still choosing to wake up the next day. After that loss, he began to share more of his heart. In interviews with teammates, even with fans, not everything, but enough to let people know he wasn't just a statue on a field. He was flesh. He was memory. He was a man learning how to be whole in a world that expected him to be perfect. He started writing again too. Small notes, short thoughts, taped above his mirror, he placed a new line. "Even in loss, we still grow." And beneath that, another, "Be the father you needed." That became his new mission. Not just to win, but to love well, to show up, to be present, to build something softer than legacy, something real. He smiled more, listened longer, held his children closer, He still trained hard, still played with fire, but his life wasn't just about goals anymore. It was about grace, about gratitude, about giving, and slowly, the world began to see it too. Not just the athlete, but the human, not just the records, but the heart. But even as healing bloomed in one corner of his life, another door was beginning to open. One that would take him far from Madrid, to a quieter place, a different league, a new rhythm, and it would ask him a question he hadn't faced in years. Who are you when no one's watching? There was something strange about the quiet. Not the kind of quiet that meant something was missing, but the kind that meant something had finally been found. Cristiano stood at the edge of the pitch, the soft hum of the stadium lights above, the night breeze brushing his face. The stands weren't full, there were no thunderous chants, just a few voices, scattered claps, and the gentle sound of cleats pressing against grass. Yet in that moment, he felt more seen than he had in years. He had just scored his 900th career goal. A number that once felt like a distant dream now lived in the pages of history. But when the ball hit the net and the referee blew the whistle, he didn't raise his arms in the air. He didn't run to the corner flag or slide across the field. He simply stood still and looked up. Not at the sky, but inward toward the small, barefoot boy from Madeira who once kicked a plastic bottle across a dirt road, pretending it was a football. Playing now in Saudi Arabia for Al Nassr, Cristiano's world had changed again. The glamour was different. The crowds were quieter, the media wasn't swarming. He had stepped away from the biggest leagues in Europe, and many questioned him for it. But he wasn't chasing the noise anymore. He was chasing stillness, meaning space to breathe. He wanted something the stadium lights couldn't offer: peace. And in these quieter games, in cities far from the roaring crowds of Madrid or Manchester, he was starting to feel that peace take root. His days followed a softer rhythm. He still trained with precision, still pushed his body with care, still studied his performance. But the edge that once pushed him to win at all costs had softened into something else. He began to mentor more, guiding the younger players with quiet words and patient eyes. They watched his movements like lessons, every stretch, every pass, every cool-down jog. He wasn't just a star to them, he was living proof of what discipline and heart could become. At home, his life was calm. The mornings began with family breakfasts, coffee brewing, children laughing, Georgina humming as she made toast. Cristiano sat at the table, not as CR7, but as Papa. He helped his son with homework, brushed his daughter's hair, held the baby close as she napped against his chest. These were the victories that didn't make headlines, but meant everything to him. And at night, when the kids were asleep and the house grew quiet, he would sometimes return to the balcony just like in Madrid, but this time, it wasn't empty. Georgina would sit beside him, their hands gently touching, the silence between them not awkward but comforting. The stars above were the same stars that had once watched over his family in Madeira. And now, decades later, he sat under them, again not with hunger or longing, but with gratitude. It was during one of these nights that he picked up a notebook he hadn't opened in years, the same one where he used to write goals, plans, and reminders to himself. He flipped through the pages slowly, smiling at the neat handwriting, the crossed-out names, the victories once dreamed of. At the end of the notebook, he added a new page. 900 goals, he wrote, and then underneath it, something softer. But the real win was keeping my heart open. He closed the book, held it for a moment, then placed it on the shelf next to an old photo of his father, the man who never saw him play professionally, the man who, even in his struggles, gave him his first ball. Cristiano stared at the photo and said quietly, "We're still going." There was a match a few weeks later, an ordinary one, not a final, not a rivalry, just a regular game under desert lights. As he walked onto the pitch, he saw a child in the front row holding a sign written in careful, uneven letters. It read, "My dream is to be like you." Cristiano stopped, walked over, and handed the boy his wristband. The child's face lit up, and in that moment, Cristiano realized something profound, that his legacy wouldn't just be measured in records or trophies, but in the spark he lit inside others, inside kids who were once like him, quiet, determined, dreaming with all their heart. Back in the locker room after the match, a younger teammate asked him, "How do you stay hungry?" Cristiano thought for a second, then replied, "I stopped chasing hunger. Now I chase meaning." The words settled in the room like soft snow. No applause, no reaction, just understanding. Because even greatness must evolve. Even fire can learn to flicker gently. He still missed some things, the roar of Old Trafford, the electric nights in Champions League stadiums. But he no longer needed them to feel alive. Now, aliveness came from different places. From hearing his daughter call his name as he walked through the door, from holding his mother's hand during her checkups, from watching Bella take her first steps in the living room while music played softly in the background. Life was no longer a sprint. It was a series of slow dances. And yet, there was still a part of him that hadn't fully been seen. A part he kept tucked away. A room in his heart that remained closed. Even to himself. But that room would soon open. Not through a match, not through a medal. But through a moment he didn't plan. A moment that brought him face to face with his younger self. Because one evening, while visiting Madeira for a short break, he took a walk alone. Back to the streets where it all began. Back to the field where his father worked. He stood there, in the fading light, remembering. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in a long time, he let the boy inside him speak. And what the boy said would change everything. In the quiet early hours of the morning, before the sun could rise, before the shops could open and the streets could wake, Cristiano Ronaldo walked alone through the streets of Funchal. His hood was pulled low, his steps slow, his breath calm. It had been years since he had truly walked these roads without cameras or security, but this visit wasn't for attention. It was for something older, something deeper, a homecoming not for the world, but for the boy inside him. The boy who used to run these hills barefoot with nothing in his pockets but dreams. He stopped at a corner he once knew by heart. The rusted gate still leaned to one side, the mailbox still crooked. A dog barked from a balcony above, the same bark that once startled him as a kid coming home late from the field. Across the street stood a building with chipped blue paint. Above it, a small window, his old bedroom. The tin roof was gone now, replaced with tiles. But the feeling was the same, a mixture of longing memory and something unspoken. Later that morning, before the museum opened to the public, Cristiano visited the CR7 Museum. The building was quiet, dark, and cool. He had the keys. He didn't tell anyone he was coming. The security guard knew him, of course, and let him in without a word. He didn't go to the golden trophies first, not to the Ballon d'Ors or the jerseys. He walked past the famous displays, past the photo walls, and toward the back of the building. There was a small room unadvertised, simple, tucked away behind a curtain. That's where he went. Inside, on a low shelf, was a glass case. And inside that case was an old, worn-out plastic trophy. Faded gold, cracked base. A label that once read, Player of the Week, Funchal U10. Now barely visible, it was his first. Given to him when he was just 8 years old, not for goals scored, but for effort. For running the hardest. For never giving up. His coach at the time had made it up, just to keep him motivated. But to Cristiano, it had meant everything. It still did. He sat down in front of that case, knees bent, arms resting on them. The museum was silent. He looked at that little trophy and saw not just a memory, but a version of himself. A boy with crooked teeth and 2 big shoes. A boy who cried when he lost. A boy who trained until his feet bled. A boy who didn't yet know how far this journey would go. That memory wrapped around him like a blanket, and without thinking, he whispered aloud, "I'd trade all the Ballon d'Ors for one more game with you, Pi." He hadn't meant to say it, but it was true. All the awards, all the titles, they meant something, yes, but they didn't erase the empty balcony. They didn't silence the old ache. They didn't bring back the man who carried his first boots in a plastic bag. The man who couldn't beat the bottle, the man who faded before the world, saw what his son had become. And in that room, surrounded by everything the world had applauded, Cristiano finally allowed himself to grieve. Not the loud grief of funerals, but the soft kind. The kind that lives in the corners of success. The kind that waits patiently behind smiles and celebrations. He closed his eyes, the silence held him. And in that stillness, he felt something shift, a release. Not of sadness, but of permission. Permission to feel, to miss, to forgive. After a while, he stood up, wiped his face, and walked slowly through the rest of the museum. He stopped briefly at the European Championship display, touched the glass. The metal glowed under the lights, but it was the memory of coaching from the sideline that stayed with him more than the prize. Then he walked past a wall of framed newspaper clippings. One caught his eye, a photo of him crying after the 2008 Champions League final. The caption read, the moment he became a legend. But he smiled because he knew the truth. That wasn't the moment. It wasn't the goals, or the fame, or the millions watching. The moment he truly became himself wasn't televised. It happened in the quiet. In locker rooms after losses, in kitchen corners at midnight, making bottles for his baby girl, in hospital chairs beside his mother's bed, in walking away from noise to protect his peace. Those were the real victories. Those were the parts that mattered. Outside, the city was beginning to stir. Shops unlocking, children laughing on their way to school. Cristiano stepped out into the morning light. He took one last look at the museum mat, his name above the door end for the first time. It didn't feel like armor. It felt like a memory, a chapter, not the whole story, just a part. He went home that afternoon to the house overlooking the sea, the same view he once saw through cracked windows. But now, the walls were clean, the rooms filled with light. His children played on the floor, building towers out of colored blocks. Georgina poured juice into small glasses. Music played low from the kitchen. And in the middle of that ordinary, beautiful moment, Cristiano smiled. He sat on the floor with his kids, held Bella in his lap, watched his son imitate his old celebration pose. And as the sun dipped lower, casting gold over everything, he realized something simple. He didn't have to prove anything anymore. He didn't have to run faster than memory, didn't have to climb higher than pain. He had arrived, not at a destination, but at himself. Later that evening, he stepped outside alone, walked barefoot across the grass, looked out over the water, and for the first time in years, he let the ocean speak. The waves rolled gently below, not shouting, just breathing, and they whispered the same message they had always held. You were enough all along. But just as he turned to go inside, his phone buzzed. A message from someone he hadn't heard from in a long time, a name that made his heart pause, and what it said would take him back once more into the quiet corners of the past, back to something he thought was finished, but never truly was. Evening had fallen gently across Madeira. The sky had turned to a soft orange, and the air carried the scent of sea salt and memory. Cristiano stood by the window of his cliffside home in Ponta do Sol, watching the sun melt into the horizon. This view had been with him since childhood. The Atlantic, wide and endless, always in motion, it was the first thing he had ever truly trusted this ocean that whispered, through the years, whether he was winning, hurting, or simply learning how to breathe again. His phone buzzed quietly on the table behind him. The message that had arrived earlier still sat unread, though he had already seen the name. It was from someone tied to a part of his past that still lived quietly within him. He hadn't spoken to this person in years, not because of anger, but because life had taken them in different directions. The message was simple. I saw your museum. I'm proud of who you became. Let's talk soon. He didn't reply right away. Instead, he stared at the screen, then set it down. He didn't need to fix anything now. He didn't need to explain. Just knowing that the past had softened enough to reach out, that was enough. There's a part of growing older that's not about slowing down, but about quieting the noise, letting go of the race, letting peace win for once. For Cristiano, that quiet had been hard-earned. Every scar, every tear, every doubt had built it. Not the medals, not the contracts, but the nights he cried alone. The mornings he trained when no one watched. The forgiveness he had to offer to the people who couldn't love him the way he needed, but loved him the way they knew. He walked through the house slowly, barefoot, pausing in rooms filled with signs of the life he had built. His daughter's drawings on the refrigerator, his son's football shoes lined up beside the door, a soft pink blanket folded neatly on the couch from a nap Georgina took earlier with the baby in her arms. This wasn't a mansion to him, it was a sanctuary, a place where fame could stay at the gate and only family could come through the door. He stepped into his study and opened a drawer quietly. Inside were letters, some unopened, some reread, so many times the creases were worn. One was from his mother, written years ago. It simply said, "No matter where you are, I'm always praying. You don't need to win to make me proud." He folded it again with gentle hands, then placed it back. There were awards in the room too, but none displayed. They were stored away behind shelves, behind books, because now they were reminders, not definitions. At 40 years old, he had begun thinking more about legacy, not the one written in statistics, but the one whispered between generations. The kind passed through stories told at bedtime, through lessons taught over dinner, through love that needed no spotlight. That evening, he texted Georgina, "Bring the kids home. Let's watch the sunset together." She replied with a heart. He smiled. Outside, the waves kept moving, their rhythm steady, their purpose ancient. He stepped onto the balcony, the wind soft against his face. He thought about his father, again not the pain, but the man, the parts of him that were never broken, the kindness, the pride he never got to show. And Cristiano whispered again, like he had before, "I forgive you." Because forgiveness is not forgetting, it's remembering without rage. It's letting grief have space and love too. His children ran out to join him. Laughter filled the air. Tiny feet pattered across the tile. He picked up Bella and kissed her head. His son leaned against his side, quiet and steady. Together, they watched the ocean. Together, they rested. The sky grew darker. The stars returned. And for the first time in a long, long time, Cristiano felt still. Truly still. He wasn't planning his next move, wasn't looking ahead to the next goal. He was here completely, and that was enough. That night, after the children were asleep and the house had settled into hush, he walked into his bedroom and sat at the edge of the bed. He picked up the small notebook, again the one that had traveled with him across continents. He turned to the last page and wrote, "This chapter is over." Not because the story ends, but because peace begins. Then, underneath a final line, the ocean never applauded. It simply was. And maybe that's the lesson. Cristiano closed the notebook slowly, placed it on the nightstand, and lay back on the bed, eyes to the ceiling, listening to the waves just outside his window. They were steady tonight, like breath, like time, like home. And maybe, just maybe, the boy who had outrun silence his whole life could finally rest. So now, dear listener, as your own breath slows, as the world outside fades into softness, ask yourself, what part of your story are you still running from? Tonight, you've journeyed through the life of a boy who came from very little. A boy who faced hunger, silence, and separation long before the world ever knew his name. You followed him from the hills of Madeira, where dreams were whispered under tin roofs. 2 grand stadiums where the cheers roared like waves crashing into the sky. But in the end, it wasn't the trophies that defined him, not the goals, not the fame, not the glittering lights of Madrid or Manchester. It was the quiet moments, the ones behind closed doors, the ones no one saw, the ones filled with soft smiles, tearful goodbyes, and silent forgiveness. Because underneath the headlines, there lived a human heart, one that longed to be seen, to be loved, not for what it could do, but for who it was. And perhaps that is what all of us truly want, to be held not in a spotlight, but in someone's arms, to be remembered not in history books, but in the warmth of someone's memory. Tonight, Cristiano's story reminds us of something gentle, that you don't have to be perfect to be powerful. You don't have to win every time to matter. You don't have to carry everything alone. Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is rest, to stop running, to take off the armor, to sit with your own story and whisper, "I'm proud of how far I've come." So as you lie there now, in your own quiet place, let yourself feel proud, not just of what you've done, but of what you've survived. The silent battles, the lonely mornings, the days you showed up even when it was hard. Let the rhythm of the waves in his story slow your thoughts. Let your breath become soft. Let your muscles loosen like pages, gently turning. And if your mind wanders, that's okay. It's just your heart learning how to relax. Learning that safety isn't found in control, but in softness. Tonight, you've witnessed a story of transformation, not from poor to rich, but from wounded to whole. And maybe, somewhere along the way, you found pieces of yourself in him, in the ache of trying too hard, in the silence after applause, in the hope that one day, someone will truly understand you. Tonight, maybe you can understand yourself a little better. You've come far, you've grown, and even if no one sees it, yet too are still worthy of love, of peace, and of rest. So breathe in now, slowly, and breathe out. Let go of the weight, let go of the noise, let go of the need to be anything more than you already are. You are here, you are enough. And just like the ocean outside Cristiano's window, you don't have to shine, you don't have to prove, you only have to be. Sleep well, dear listener, your story is still unfolding. And tomorrow, you begin again, softly, bravely, peacefully. Good night.